You can all see the screen. If you can't, somebody please feel free to let me know. But hopefully you can see everything. So like I say, I'm flying solo today. So we're going to be talking about, it's all about safety regulation. But not just about GPSR. Yay! To talk about something different. We're going to be talking about changes to what we call vertical sector regulations. So the Toy Directive, Machinery Directive, and so on. We will be talking a little bit about GPSR, but that's just by means of an update following the EU's Commission notice last year. So, as always, I have prepared a brief agenda, quite a lengthy agenda there actually. As always, you'll get a copy of these slides and you will also get a link to the recording. So don't feel like you need to take copious notes. So we're going to be talking about a little bit more about the EU product safety architecture, and that might explain how, if you were sad like me and read regulation from cover to cover, you'd see that it all follows the same format. So we'll talk a little bit about that, about the kind of regulatory architecture. We'll cover the updates on GPSR and how that's impacting core obligations and what we're seeing. Obviously, GTD is an authorised representative for GPSR, so we'll talk about some of the things that we're seeing now that the regulation has entered into its second full year now. And then we're going to be talking specifically about those changes to some of those long-standing directives. I mentioned machinery, toys, but there's also construction products, medical devices, and the radio equipment directive as well, which is one that a lot of companies find themselves having to comply with. And then we'll talk about the kind of acts and regulations that are forcing the update of these directives, which is really around sustainability, digitalization, AI, cybersecurity, and not least the product liability directive, which extends your obligation for liability from 10 years to 25 years and what that means as a manufacturer. We'll talk about the impact, and then we'll talk about, overall kind of market surveillance and enforcement trends. Obviously, online marketplaces have a much bigger role to play than ever in terms of EU regulation. And then we'll talk about what the compliance roadmap looks like from now through to 2030. Okay, so hang on to your hats. It's going to be a thrilling ride, not. I can't make it sexy. I've never managed to do that with regulation. But let's talk about what product safety, why EU product safety matters, essentially. So it goes without saying that it ensures safe products for 450 million plus consumers, and it creates that single market with harmonised rules. So the thought is that every product manufactured or imported into the EU shares the same product safety requirements and therefore is safe to circulate throughout the 27 member states. It supports, or the EU would say it supports innovation, digitalisation and sustainability, or at least moving forward it does as we see these changes. So EU product safety laws built on principles that the EU will say makes it easy for companies to innovate while staying compliant. So, it will say it has technology neutral rules, so allow new materials, digital features, manufacturing methods, and so on to be introduced without rewriting legislation. We obviously have the harmonised standards, which is what you would have heard me referring to throughout GPSR that we would have really benefited from, which give you that predictable route to compliance and reduce that time to market for new products. And then CE marking, that kite mark, which some of you that have to comply with vertical sector regulation will be familiar with obtaining that certificate of conformity and applying that CE mark. And that's kind of like that trust mark is that single trusted access point into the entire EU market, lowering regulatory friction. And actually it's a kite mark that's well respected globally as well. those of you who may have been looking at the UKCA mark in the past and dual marking standards, there's no longer a requirement to do that if you don't want to. So the UK, or GB rather, will accept the CE mark in perpetuity now, rather than pushing ahead with its UKCA proprietary standard, if you like. And then also around innovation, obviously we have to mention digital product passports, because they are providing that structured data environment that support advanced manufacturing, traceability back to source, and that whole circular economy business model as well. So we personally are encouraging our clients to start working on digital product passports now, even though they're not necessarily enforceable. And with regulation like GPSR, we're still mandated to hand out physical copies of labeling and manuals and so on. But the trajectory of travel is that every product will have a digital product passport, and it becomes a lot easier to manage. That digital product passport will store everything from safety information to sustainability information and scores to marketing information. It will basically be visible to eventually customs, competent authorities, consumers, anyone that needs to access information stored on that digital product passport will be able to, depending on what their kind of visibility levels are, if you like. Digitalization as well is obviously a core part of the EU's strategy moving forward, not just on safety, but on customs control and everything. The UK has paused its single window kind of digitalization project for customs, but the EU is forging ahead with its own platform, if you like. So eventually our products will go into the EU entirely, everything will be entirely digital. Any customs controls can be controlled via the digital product passport, so customers can scan the QR code, see all of the information from any licenses, any certifications, commodity code details, all sorts of stuff. Everything will be housed within that digital product passport. So digitalization is very much now embedded in the EU's product safety architecture, as well as other areas. So digital product passports will become mandatory across many sectors under ESPR, and those of you that have seen our webinars on that know that there is a first tranche of products that fall within those requirements. But then there will be an additional working plan announced probably 2.5 to 3 years from now, which will include the next tranche of products that have to comply with digital product passports. But again, like I say, they provide that real-time access to that product data, material data, repairability data, recyclability data. Everything will be housed from that digital product passport. The online marketplaces under obligations under GPSR now require digital monitoring and automatic or automated detection of unsafe listings and rapid removal of dangerous products. So that's another way in which product safety has been digitalized, because it allows online marketplaces to rapidly scan their product listings to see who's compliant and who's not, and take action on the ones that aren't. And obviously digitalization supports smart supply chain integration. So that digital traceability supports predictive maintenance, automated compliance checks, AI-enabled risk management, and so on. Sustainability, you've heard me present on a lot of that, because when I look at EU regulation and actually regulation around the globe at the moment, a lot of it is linked to sustainability. And it's actually now almost inseparable from product safety and EU law. So there are several mechanisms that drive that, not least of which is the eco-design for sustainable products. So that requires products to be more durable, repairable, energy efficient, and recyclable. And obviously digital product passports are the means of communicating that data, if you like. The circular economy alignment with digital product passports and ESPR rules are kind of reshaping how products are designed, how they're used, how they're recovered, how they're end-of-lifed, and how they're remanufactured and recycled. And then that transparency across supply chains is so much easier with with digitalisation. So those of you that have heard me present on the EUDR regulation, you'll know that actually traceability back to source is really detailed. So, for leather goods, you would have to be able to trace back to where that cattle was born, where it was raised, where it was slaughtered, and where the leather was processed. So that traceability back to source required for sustainability purposes and to prevent, deforestation and so on, relies massively on digitalization. So they're all kind of like inextricably linked now. So the key message I want to get across on this slide is the EU framework for product safety is undergoing huge overhaul, its biggest reform in 20 years, as I've put here, because of innovation, digitalization, and sustainability. That's really what's driving this massive overhaul. So the product safety architecture, you've heard me talk about GPSR before. GPSR is very much a horizontal safety law, and it kind of mops up all of those general products that don't fall within harmonised sector-specific legislation. So products that aren't defined as toys or machinery are mopped up by GPSR, but also GPSR, as you know, has an impact on harmonised sector specific legislation. So it's kind of anything that is lacking in that sector specific legislation, GPSR acts as a kind of safety net overlayer for that. So where something's lacking, you default to GPSR. So there's two sets of regulation that apply to safety regulations, so that apply to toys and to machinery and so on. But then there's another set of supporting frameworks that are being used to update this sector-specific legislation now. Market surveillance regulation has been overhauled. We've now got cybersecurity regulation in the form of the Cyber Resilience Act. We've got sustainability, which I've mentioned in terms of ESPR, digital product passport, even packaging waste regulation, because as we know, when it comes to safety, we should be looking not just at our product itself, but we should be looking at packaging as well. And then the liability that we face as manufacturers or economic actors is significantly more robust now because of the Product Liability Directive. And one of the areas now that I would say that that's been updated significantly is that term of liability, which has always been 10 years, and now that's been increased to 25 years. So that's a significant change. So compliance now spans safety, digital, and sustainability obligations, and we need to be on top of what that means. So general product safety regulation, we know this, it modernised safety for general products. It's a major overhaul from the old product safety directive, but it incorporates digital components, online marketplaces, things that really weren't in existence or weren't as prolific as they are now when that directive was first drafted in 2002. So we know it's been enforced since December 24. We're now in our second year of full compliance. It's directly applicable across the EU, across Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, and across Northern Ireland as well, due to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework. And as I say, it covers all consumer products, including those sold online. And it covers those, includes, because of ESPR, it covers those products that have been refurbished or recycled, those products that originally might have been designed for trade or professional use, but have migrated into the hands of consumers due to being, sold secondhand, for example. Importantly, GPSR does address those AI software updates and connected devices that kind of existing vertical sector regulation currently hasn't addressed. So GPSR is kind of like bridging the gap for this new innovative digitalization environment until the vertical sector regulation is updated in full, and then that will be the core one that those of you in that sector look towards for guidance. Core obligations, as we know, risk assessment covering the physical, the chemical, mechanical, and cybersecurity risks, traceability across the whole supply chain. So with our clients as an authorised rep, we mandate as part of their technical file that we are tracking details of their upstream manufacturers and suppliers, so that in the event of a product safety issue and we were called upon to produce the technical file, we would be able to prove traceability kind of back to source, or as far as we possibly can do. The responsible person for non-EU manufacturers, obviously that's the likes of ourselves and other authorised representatives, but some companies may be looking to their importers to do that job, or their fulfilment service providers. But the post-market monitoring and incident reporting was a massive kind of like overhaul from what was existing in the old directive, and is facilitated by, you know, better digitalization and so on as well. We'll talk about that in a second. We've now got digital recall mechanisms. So you'll remember when GPSR came out, the EU produced a recall notice translated into all 24 official languages, and that is the kind of mechanism to be used, or the document to be used, when an official recall is instigated. And then online marketplace duties. So they have huge obligations to make sure that their sellers are compliant. You know, they have to cooperate with customs and competent authorities and police authorities and so on around fraudulent product or unsafe product. They have the powers to take down unsafe listings. They have the powers to thoroughly vet and verify the sellers that are using their platform. So GPSR, as I said here, forces you guys as businesses to demonstrate that you're proactive in terms of your ongoing safety management, okay, which I'm sure all of you on this call today are. What's new for 2026? So obviously the second year of GPSR being in force, it's a milestone year because a lot of the GPSR obligations have matured. We've seen enforcement both at the customs level and the competent authorities level tighten somewhat, and we've seen more activity around online marketplaces that are starting to pull up sellers, and we've seen those sellers come through to us to make sure that we can get them compliant. So we've seen kind of consolidation of GPSR enforcement across all member states towards the back end of the last year and this year. So now all member states, and I'm pretty certain when I say this, have operationalized their market surveillance structures under GPSR. So initially, in the very early days, we were seeing queries come through from German customs and French customs. Now we're starting to see them come through from other markets. As you can tell, the regulation's starting to bite. The new recall and corrective action procedures have been implemented, and the European Commission has published guidance back in November last year that kind of clarifies obligations for producers, importers, distributors, and online marketplaces. So that's it's not a delegated act, it's a Commission notice, but it kind of looked at the first 12 months of implementation of the regulations, saw where the difficult spots were, where there was need for extra clarity, and that document served as that extra clarity. And I'm delighted that when we read it, I sighed a huge sigh of relief to realise that we'd interpreted the regulation correctly, and there wasn't anything there that gave us a nasty surprise. But that guidance obviously covered the obligations for marketplaces, and just reinforced the fact that, you know, it's real-time cooperation with authorities, it's rapid removal of unsafe listings and so on. So it clarified their situation. The other thing that we're seeing, like I say, that post-market monitoring is starting to kick in as well. So we've had a lot of dialogues with clients more recently. Now that they've got their labeling sorted, their technical files and so on are underway, we're having conversations with clients about that post-market monitoring. So, in the event of an audit, what would they need to be able to demonstrate that they had in place by means of procedures and so on, and documentation, just to prove that they've got that post-market monitoring nailed. So, it's things like automated monitoring of consumer complaints and online reviews, integration of safety gate alerts. So back on some of my GPSR webinars, I'd say, well, if you were sad like me, you'd listen to the safety gate alerts. I don't think it's, and a lot of people would think, well, it's not really applicable to me. I'll just use the safety gate portal as and if there is a product safety issue. Actually, in terms of a process, maybe showing that you monitor those safety gate alerts is not a bad thing in terms of a documented process internally. Documented risk analysis procedures, faster incident reporting workflows, that kind of stuff. All the stuff that you would do for demonstrating that you have good compliance with customs, just adopt that same mindset for good compliance with post-market surveillance as well. And some of you might already have that, having worked with CE mark products for a very long time. But you really want to be able to demonstrate that kind of continuous life cycle oversight, if you like. Also, the notice gave further clarification around emerging technologies, so AI, Internet of Things, connected devices, and so on. So the 2025 guidance clarified how GPSR applies to AI-enabled consumer products, Internet of Things devices, software updates, and how they can affect product safety and cybersecurity related risks as well. And so this year, those clarifications become the baseline expectations. When competent authorities are looking or auditing importers within the EU or manufacturers within the EU, they're looking for that kind of demonstrated oversight, if you like. And then we know that GPSR already set the groundwork for integration with the Digital Services Act, which provides all of that marketplace obligations, the AI Act, ESPR, the Cyber Resilience Act, and so on. So this year, companies, and our clients included, we're urging them to increasingly start to adopt those regulations and legislations as part of a kind of multi-regulatory approach to that whole digital product ecosystem, if you like. So in preparation for the digital product passport, what would go in there that makes sure that a product is compliant with not just product safety, but with all of those other kind of complementary frameworks and regulation that sits alongside those and has a direct impact on those. What else? I'm conscious I'm waffling a little bit here. We know obviously GPSR is horizontal, but now that sectoral legislation like the Toy Directive, the Manufacturing Directive and so on, or the Machinery Directive and so on, is being updated to align with it. And we'll go through some specific slides there. So this year we anticipate guidance for toys, electronics, machinery. Well, the machinery regulation is already out. It's been out since 2023, I think, but doesn't come into force until 2027. We've obviously had big overhauls to the REACH regulation and also to the chemical safety regulation as well, so the CLP updates. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I think there's a ton of webinars over on the YouTube channel. I'm sure there's a CLP one and a REACH regulation one as well. But essentially, if you're selling into the EU now, you should ensure that you've got that post market surveillance monitoring system up and running. You've got that full traceability back to source. You've got that post-market monitoring system. You've got the responsible person for your EU products. You've got at least the start, we are starting to think about that kind of digital first product information, so QR codes, online manuals, which classic example is the machinery directive now is going to permit from 2027 online manuals rather than hard copy manuals, although a consumer, a business or a consumer can still ask for the hard copy manuals. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and that compliance, as I say, is no longer static. It's rapidly moving, and it requires kind of like continuous monitoring, which hopefully GTD helps you do. So the harmonised legislation. So as I mentioned before, the if you look at the new machinery regulation, compare it to GPSR and so on like that, then you'll see that it all follows a very structured route. Okay, so it all sets out obligations for manufacturers, for distributors, for importers, for other economic operators. It always sets essential safety requirements. And with that harmonised legislation, it talks you through the CE marking process, if you like, and defines what conformity assessment route you need to take. Can you self-assess the product, or do you need to hand the product over to a third party notified body to conduct that assessment? And then the kind of standards that you need to use and how market surveillance authorities will enforce it. Now, that's all down to the new legislative framework that came in 2008, which set out kind of like the standard for that regulation, so that every piece of regulation looks similar. Anybody involved in it, in the safety of a product, would know exactly where in the legislation to go to locate that kind of information. The key harmonised regulations that we're expecting this year, obviously I mentioned before, the machinery regulation's been in since 2023, but it applies from January next year. So it's had quite a gap between coming into force and actually being directly implemented, if you like. It covers autonomous machinery, digital instructions, and software safety. They're kind of like the major changes to it, as well as kind of like a general overhaul to make sure that it's fit for purpose. The radio equipment directive, it's not being replaced as such, but it's being updated. So it will have new delegated acts on cybersecurity and data protection. The toy safety regulation, we're expecting 2026, 2027, which very much the changes in that are very much linked to stronger chemical restrictions. Again, that kind of digitalization and AI focus, as well as better online sales controls. And then construction products regulation has the digital product passport integration. And then medical devices, overall, the process of assessing medical devices is being simplified to try and reduce the delay of products getting to market, and also there's stricter post-market surveillance on that. So that's at a very high level what is already through or coming through. So overall, the sector-specific regulation is becoming tighter, especially around digital capabilities and chemical safety in the case of toys and construction products. So we're going to do a deep dive into these ones that I've mentioned. So we're going to look at the machinery regulation first and foremost. So essentially the machinery directive, as it was, is no longer really fit for purpose. It's 15 years old, and it struggles to address things like autonomous and AI-enabled machinery, software-driven safety functions, cybersecurity threats, digitally delivered instructions and documentation, which the market's been asking for some time, and then complex supply chains and cross-border e-commerce. So the regulation itself is no longer fit for purpose. So the new regulation, again, changing from a directive to regulation, aims to close those gaps and align with the EU's broader digital and product safety agenda, if you like. So as you'll have heard me say before, directive to regulation means direct direct applicability and more legal certainty, rather than having individual member states transpose that directive into their national law. And that's where you get national variations, you get regulatory scope creep and so on. Also, regulations are immediately effective, legally speaking, and there's greater consistency for multinational manufacturers, obviously, because they may be shipping pan-Euro and they know that they're complying with one set of regulation rather than 27 different variants. So their cross-jurisdictional compliance becomes a lot easier with fewer divergences and a lot more detailed obligations, which helps you comply. Cybersecurity and industrial security requirements. So for the first time with the manufacturing regulation, cybersecurity is explicitly part of machinery safety. So protection against unauthorized access, prevention of manipulation of safety functions, requirements for secure software updates. That aligns with the EU's broader digital product safety framework, like the Cyber Resilience Act, the AI Act, and so on. So for the first time, that cybersecurity is explicitly part of the regulation, and it's a pretty meaty piece of regulation, I can tell you. We'll probably do a dedicated webinar on that. We'll plan that in over the coming months or so on. There are, within the regulation as well, new high-risk machinery categories. So Annex 1 has been completely restructured, and some machinery types now require mandatory third-party involvement, so assessment via notified bodies rather than self-assessment. That's where products have safety-related control systems, machinery with AI-based safety functions, certain lifting equipment falls within Annex 1, and machinery posing significant crushing, cutting, or entrapment risks. So that affects, obviously, the conformity assessment pathways and has an impact on compliance cost if you have to outsource the compliance to a notified body rather than making sure that you can do that assessment in-house. So I think it's good to refer to Annex 1 and see whether the products that you manufacture at this point are going to require that, that third-party assessment, because you'll have to budget that in. The introduction of digital instructions and documentation being called for by the market for some time now. So manufacturers can now provide digital instructions in however many languages they need to online. EU declarations of conformity can be online as well, and digital markings with some exceptions. But end users, as I said earlier, can still request that they have a hard copy or a paper copy of the user manual or the instructions. But that's a massive operational change for documentation workflows and should, over time, reduce costs massively. Software as a safety component is now integrated into the regulation. So software is now explicitly recognized as a safety component, meaning that it might need CE marking. It might fall under high risk categories, and updates. It's the recognition that updates can trigger substantial transformation obligations, which can, if there's been a software update, I'm wearing somebody else's teeth today, software update that has triggered substantial modification, then the whole risk assessment and conformity assessment may need to be redone based on the substantially modified product, if you like. So that's really crucial, that the areas that we see this impacting would be those for automation, robotics, advanced manufacturing, that kind of thing. There is a huge section that clarifies substantial modification rules as well. So the new regulation clarifies when a machine becomes new due to substantial modification and must undergo new conformity assessment. So there are significant changes to safety functions, then it would require new conformity assessment. If software updates, like I said, had altered behaviour or modifications affecting essential health and safety requirements, then that would trigger a new conformity assessment. So that's really important for things like maintenance, retrofits, and any kind of aftermarket services. If you like, you need to be aware of your obligations under that substantial modification. There are expanded obligations for importers and distributors. So now those economic operators must verify digital documentation. They have to ensure that cybersecurity related requirements are met, maintain traceability records, and cooperate with market surveillance authorities. So it's just taken what under the old directive put a huge burden of responsibility on manufacturers that started to share that with other players, at least in the areas of verification, fit for market, and traceability. It's starting to share that burden with other players in the distribution chain. So across the whole chain, that compliance burden is kind of like shared rather than sitting exclusively with the manufacturer. As I said, the regulation entered into force in July 2023. It applies fully from next January, but until then, the machinery directive remains applicable. But obviously the purpose of you guys being on the call today is you want to prepare for the new changes coming in. So it's never too early to start looking at that regulation. And like I say, we'll put a webinar on for that. The radio equipment directive, so it's not being replaced, as I said, but it's undergoing some of its most significant changes since 2014. The EU identified 3 major gaps with RED. Insufficient cybersecurity protection for connected devices, fragmented charging solutions, which were causing consumers huge frustration and a lot of unnecessary e-waste, and then slow updates to harmonised standards for emerging technologies. So it's introduced changes and linked it to 2 major legislative updates. The RED Delegated Act on Cybersecurity, which I can share with you if you'd like a copy, introduced mandatory cybersecurity requirements for certain radio equipment from August of last year. And then the Common Charger Directive obviously introduced those mandatory USB-C charging and charger unbundling for most portable devices from December 2024, which is now we're all kind of moving from those lightning devices with Apple phones, which I don't think I've got any now, to USB-C chargers. And then the Commission is continuing to update harmonised standards. So they've added 20 new standards and they've removed 1. So that's a big body of work that they're undergoing. Standards that are linked to the RED, are being updated. Cybersecurity for RED is now mandatory. So from August last year, certain categories of radio equipment have to meet essential new cybersecurity requirements. So they're devices like smart speakers, connected toys, wearable devices, Internet of Things devices, and gaming consoles. So new requirements include network protection. So devices cannot harm network performance or misuse network resources. Also data protection. So devices must safeguard personal data and privacy. All of this is, is stuff that you're probably already doing, but the regulation makes it explicit, or the changes to RED make it explicit. And then fraud prevention. So devices can't be easily exploitable for fraud. All of these requirements are legally binding and have applied to all equipment placed on the EU market and in Northern Ireland from August last year. So if you think that you fall short of some of these requirements, then get in touch with us and we can point you in the right direction. This is a huge shift for RED. Like I say, the biggest overhaul since 2014. Cybersecurity is not just a core safety requirement under RED, and it's not an operational add-on, sorry, it's kind of like a core requirement under RED. I've mentioned about USB-C becomes mandatory. We know about that. We've seen the effect in the market. And I've talked about the new harmonised standards update. So 20 new ones, 1 removed, and 3 standards amended with updated restrictions. So this has a massive impact on conformity assessment and technical documentation for many device categories. So if you think you're kind of like, what do I do? Then get in touch and we can help. Toy safety regulations. So a little bit like the machinery directive. The toy directive was no longer adequate for a quite rapidly evolving chemicals science space. You know, different hazards are being uncovered all the time, hence the update to REACH regulation and CLP regulation. It had no provision for AI enabled and connected toys. Nothing regarding digital documentation, and not a huge amount around traceability needs as well. And there has been over the last, and it may coincide with a lot of product coming in from further afield into the EU, but there has been a significant uptick in toy-related alerts in the EU that are reported via the safety gate system. So the new regulation is seen as being able to deliver a really high and more consistent level of child protection. Chemical safety is massive under the new regulation, so it becomes significantly stricter. I would say that chemicals are probably, or those substances of concern are the main driver for the reform. So the new regulation introduces automatic bans for hazardous substances, so those classified as CMR, as we call it, as carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic. I can never say that word. There are stronger controls on endocrine disruptors, allergens, and other harmful substances, and there's a more precautionary approach to emerging chemical risks as well. So the toy safety regulation really needs to be read in conjunction with CLP and REACH regulation as well. But it's a major shift from the old toy directive, which relied more heavily on a case-by-case restriction. This is a lot more explicit, a lot more detailed. The digital product passport, so the regulation replaces the traditional EU declaration of conformity with a digital product passport, which is fantastic. So the digital product passport, as I mentioned earlier, will store safety, compliance, traceability information. It'll be accessible via authorities, economic operators, customs, and there'll be a restricted view for consumers, just showing them what they need to see. And obviously it has significant support for market surveillance authorities and customs who are responsible with the kind of restriction of placing the product on the market, and also the recall process should there be a product safety issue in the EU. It essentially aligns the Toy Safety Directive with the EU's broader digital product sustainability and chemicals regulation. It brings it really into the modern day. AI enabled and connected toys. So the regulation explicitly addresses toys with artificial intelligence, especially those with safety relevant functions, toys with interconnected or interactive features, including social interactions and capabilities. So when AI enabled toys that require third-party conformity assessment will be treated as high-risk AI systems under the new EU AI Act. So if your toys fall within that kind of area where they're usually tested by third-party conformity assessment houses, then they should be notifying you really of these updates and requiring that you redo your conformity assessment. The scope in terms of the number of toys that are covered, or the type of toys that are covered, is broadly similar to the directive, but now it explicitly includes catapults and slings as toys as well. And that's very random and out there, so I'm not thinking we've got any catapult manufacturers on here, but you never know. And it closes a kind of long-term or a long-standing gap with the old directive by introducing those two new types of toys. As with the machinery directive, it looks to spread more of the compliance obligations throughout the supply chain. So, importers, distributors, other economic operators have obligations to check compliance with stricter chemical and digital requirements, check the digital product passport, make sure that traceability is covered, and so on. So it shares the burden again from just the manufacturer of the toy throughout those economic operators that have a responsibility to place a safe toy in the EU marketplace. And conformity assessment and documentation. So again, there are updated conformity assessment routes, especially for those toys with AI or digital safety functions. So you may need to budget for having those toys assessed by a third party if you fall within that category. Obviously, where there's updated standards and updated conformity assessment, then there's going to be updated technical documentation that accompanies those products, even though it may be stored online. And the regulation strengthens the role of those notified bodies for those higher risk categories, if you like. So essentially, it's a massive change, not in terms of necessarily the product scope, but in terms of the safety compliance for that product. So again, if you're in the toy space and any of this is blowing your mind at the minute, then get in touch and we can help you through it. Construction products, I'm very mindful of time, so I'm just going to flip through this one. The CPR, or the Construction Products Regulation, is being revised, if you like. So essentially, the EU feels that it wasn't functioning well enough to deliver that kind of seamless full EU market exploitation, if you like. So there was too much divergence between different member states and so on. Also, it was seen to be too complex. It didn't support the EU sustainability goals at all. Of course, some construction products like cement and so on are high carbon emitters, and obviously that's an area that the EU is cutting down on with CBAM and other different regulatory levers. So there was a lot of stuff that needed changing there. Again, construction products will be a big focus of ESPR and digital product passports. We're already seeing that with aluminium and steel and iron, steel, aluminium, concrete, cement, that kind of thing. So there's a lot undergoing. I would say, just in the interest of time, we'll skip over that one. If you are in the construction products sector, then by all means reach out, book a global trade clinic, and we can talk you through what your obligations are there. And medical devices regulation. So this is being revised. It's already regulation. It was just seen to be too complex. Notified bodies weren't seen to be having enough powers, if you like, and also capacity. The kind of availability and capacity of notified bodies, which are mandatory for a lot of medical devices, were causing bottlenecks and a really delayed response to getting products to market. The regulation as well has seemed to impose disproportionate burdens on SMEs, particularly micro enterprises. So there was a lot wrong with that. And there have been significant enhancements. I suppose I'm trying to think of the ones to really focus on. Obviously, AI and software related updates are included in the regulation. The medical devices regulation is kept relatively well updated, as you can appreciate, because it has a direct impact on human health, for example. So the updates are more about giving more powers and making it more attractive for notified bodies to move into that field, reducing the complexity for SMEs, and making sure that the regulation aligns with the AI Act and software related updates. And yeah, again, with that sector, get in touch if there's anything that you're not quite sure about. As I said at the very beginning, product safety regulation, the overhaul that we're seeing, particularly of the sectors that I've mentioned, are really focused on digitalization and AI. So digitalization is obviously changing product safety. It introduces new capabilities, and with those new capabilities come new risks. So the EU is focusing essentially on three major transformations. So connected products and software driven behavior. So where products increasingly rely on software connectivity and remote updates, they obviously can change the safety profile of products after sale. You could have new failure modes like cybersecurity vulnerabilities, toys affecting physical safety, products affecting physical safety. And there's obviously a need, because of these new risks, to impose greater continuous monitoring rather than one-time conformity checks. So the EU now treats cybersecurity as essentially an additional safety dimension, and as a result of that, software updates that affect safety fall under regulatory control. So companies are going to have to prove how they monitor that after sales process for safety issues. Digital traceability and life cycle data. So obviously digitalization enables digital product passports, which are fantastic. QR code based safety information, real-time traceability across supply chains, and that automated recall and consumer notification systems. But importantly, those tools support faster detection of unsafe products and more effective corrective actions. And where that's facilitated, market surveillance authorities are going to impose the requirement for that as well. As companies increasingly have the tools, then market surveillance authorities will tighten the obligations that they have to comply with. AI is massively transforming product safety. So in two ways: AI inside products and AI used to regulate products. So AI as part of a product can cause a problem. So these are kind of where you have connected devices. They have to be proven to address and be proven to be safe in the areas of cybersecurity, data protection, and interoperability. So product safety regulation overlaps with the AI Act, the Cyber Resilience Act, and the NIS2 directive. We are going to be running a webinar, I believe, on the Cyber Resilience Act in the coming weeks, either via the chambers or via ourselves. But what I wanted to get across is that digital safety is now inseparable from that physical product safety, which we saw with GPSR, but is even tighter with the sector regulation that I've referred to. Whizzing through here, sustainability and circular economy impact. So we know that the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation imposes the requirement of digital product passports, and it imposes the requirement of durability, repairability, recyclability requirements, and others around that whole circular economy design. That can pose additional product safety risks where you are repairing or recycling product. Similarly, where you are placing on the market products that have been refurbished or they're second hand, it doesn't negate their requirement to still meet stringent safety requirements. And under regulation, obviously, especially GPSR, refurbishers of those companies that are undertaking that work are increasingly treated as the manufacturer, which there are a number of our clients that fall within that area. I've mentioned that we've got new CLP hazard classifications. We've got the overhaul of the REACH regulation, and we've got digital labeling options now. So sustainability obligations, as well as AI and digitalization, are now interacting directly with product safety compliance, and I would say are in many respects equally as important, because so much of what we do from the sustainability perspective kind of restricts or bans those substances of concern that may have been in products previously that are now banned through REACH and so on, but are also, that's reinforced through sustainability regulation as well. So it's all kind of like meshed together, if you like. The revised product liability directive, there is a webinar on our YouTube channel that feel free to access and take a look at that. For me, I think the biggest change here is it changes the burden of proof for claimants. So the revised Product Liability Directive makes it easier for those injured parties to prove a defect within the product or a causal link between the defect in the product and the damage. It becomes a lot easier. It's a lot more heavily weighted in the benefit of the claimant, if you like. And then I think it's that liability eligibility, kind of that's extended from 10 years to 25, which is a significant change and may require you to go back and speak to your insurance companies to understand how that impacts premiums and your product liability insurance and so on. So that liability exposure is increasing. So that documentation, traceability, cover your backside stuff is becoming even more critical. Again, take a look at that webinar and get in touch if you've got any issues. Role of economic operators. So again, I think I've mentioned this all the way through, just the overhauls of the regulation I've focused on, like toys, machinery, and so on, shares the obligations of compliance to other economic operators within the supply chain. So it's not just the manufacturer that takes the burden. Overwhelmingly, the buck stops with them, but there are other obligations explicit within the regulation placed on those other economic operators. So every actor in the supply chain now has a defined legal duty. Market surveillance authorities, as I said, the digital tools for product tracking and recall monitoring and so on are making it easier and easier for market surveillance authorities to impose these obligations on economic operators. Increased focus in terms of what they're looking at and focusing on in the next 2 to 3 years. Obviously, online marketplaces solidifying their processes for vetting sellers and removing unsafe product, but they are always going to be looking at third country sellers. So, you know, when we had GPSR in place and so many people were saying, well, our EU counterparts don't seem to be thinking about that. And that's because they don't have to get product into the EU. The it's already in the EU. We in Great Britain have to get the product through customs, the eyes and ears of market surveillance authorities. So customs are always going to be looking and increasingly looking as that, you know, those digital tools become more widespread, looking at the compliance of third country sellers. And obviously they're focusing on AI enabled products and digital products now, and children's products are always going to be a focus. They're one of the most stringent pieces of regulation, and obviously electrical and connected devices as well. There are more each member state is able to set its own penalties and public enforcement actions. We're seeing listed higher fiscal penalties, you know, in excess of 200,000 euros now being listed for kind of fraudulent, negligent actions. Custodial sentences are still kind of like capped at 6 months from what we can see, but enforcement's definitely becoming more coordinated, more data driven, and more visible. And of course, remember that different competent authorities in the EU can liaise directly with their counterparts in other countries as well. So that extraterritorial reach, if you like. Compliance roadmap for 2026 to 2030. So obviously, take a look at your technical documentation, revisit your risk assessments, understand which new regulation or new changes are going to directly impact your product. You can never be too strict in terms of the vetting of your suppliers. If your current suppliers are not helping you stay compliant with your regulatory obligations within the EU, then it's time to look for other suppliers that can help you achieve that, you know, those kind of requirements placed upon you. Traceability back to source being really important with certain pieces of EU regulation. Implement cybersecurity by design if your products fall within those realms of having any kind of digital or AI enabled functions. Prepare for digital product passports. We're doing an updated digital product passport webinar in a couple of weeks' time, where we'll share with you some of the changes that have come into play. Look to review contracts with marketplaces and fulfillment partners to make sure that they understand what their obligations are to help you remain compliant. And this post-market monitoring system, if you don't have one already, or it's not a documented process, then I'd urge you to start looking at that so that you can show in the event of an audit or in the event of a product safety issue and you're investigated, that you have very strict processes that you adhere to in the event of any product safety issues. And then obviously train teams on these new regulatory obligations around AI, digital safety, sustainability, and so on. And then I am rushing through because we've gone way over time. The last couple of slides are literally just the support that's on offer. The only things that I bring to your attention on here are the GTD platform. Well, first of all, you know that the Global Trade Clinic is open to all of you. So if any of you are scratching your heads at the minute thinking you don't know where to go from here, you can book a Global Trade Clinic session with one of us. The thing I bring to your attention is the GTD platform is extending to provide pan-European compliance for extended producer responsibility. So a single source of data entry for compliance across the EU for packaging initially, and then we'll extend to waste electricals and batteries. We are going to have traceability back to source for compliance with EU deforestation, regulatory compliance. And digital product passports, we have already started working on the framework for those clients that want to get ahead of the curve in terms of having the digital product passport there and just making those changes as it evolves and as the new delegated acts come in. So there's a wealth of stuff going on with the GTD platform. We